everybody, welcome back for pretty much the last time to Glaciers and Glacial Geomorphology. Step 12, congratulations, you've made it to the end of the module, well done. So in this final session I'm just going to say a few words about one last topic to draw the subject matter of the module to a close, and then say a few words about the module as a whole and where I hope it's brought you to. So the last topic that I want to introduce is the topic of deglaciation. We've talked about glaciers, we've talked about glaciology and glacier dynamics, we've talked about geomorphology, but what happens right at the end of the story, if you like? So what's at the end of the story for glaciers and glacial geomorphology? And I'm going to suggest that, well, the end of the story is deglaciation. We always talk about what's happening during glacial conditions. So when the glacier is still there doing stuff, what's the glacier doing? What landforms is a glacier making? But we have to remember that for glaciated landscapes, the last point at which they were being affected by glaciers was at a point when the glaciers were disappearing. That's a point that glacial geomorphologists sometimes don't put enough attention on. The last moment of glacial geomorphology is a moment of glaciers disappearing, a moment of deglaciation. And deglaciation, obviously, it affects the glaciers, it affects the kinds of processes that are going on, the kind of environment that's existing around a glacier, lots of meltwater, for example, in lots of situations, and therefore that deglaciation, through affecting the glaciers, affects the landscapes also. But deglaciation also has a direct effect on landforms, including landforms that have already been created in the glacial setting. So the question really at this stage is, how well do glacial features survive deglaciation? And in that slide that you can see on the image there, we're looking at a landscape of deglaciation. What you're looking at there is a crevasse fill ridge. There's me for scale in the distance there. And I'm standing just off the glacier, and the person taking the photo is standing on the glacier surface. And that ridge, which is running away from the person on the glacier past me into the distance, is debris that used to be the infill of a glacial crevasse. But as the glacier has been ablating away, the crevasse fill has been exposed, and now at this late stage, instead of having a crevasse cutting down into the ice, we have a ridge of debris left on top of the ice, and as the ice is finally disappearing, that deglaciation is leaving behind that ridge of sediment as part of a supraglacial land system left behind in the landscape after the glacier has disappeared. So that is very much a landform and a landscape which is being created by processes very much associated with the deglaciation end of the time spectrum through which glaciers are doing their work. Now, with erosional or hard landforms, if you want to think of them in that way, such as these glacial mountains, this is at the edge of the Athabasca, or next to the adjacent to the Athabasca Glacier in British Columbia, that rigid bed landscape, those erosional features in the mountains, those are going to survive pretty well if the glacier disappears. They don't care too much about a glacier coming and going, and so deglaciation isn't going to have an obvious immediate impact on that kind of pre-existing landform. But suppose you consider depositional landforms or soft landforms, such as these couple of little moraines at the edge of the Greenland ice sheet. What's going to happen to those as you remove the glacier at the end of the glacial period? Now, in some situations you might say, well, nothing much is going to happen, because look, here's a photograph of a cross-section through an old moraine. This is again in West Greenland, but this moraine is sitting out in front of the ice sheet margin now. It isn't being directly affected by the glacier. As far as that moraine is concerned, the glacier came, it built this feature, and then it went away again. Subsequently, a river has carved through the moraine and exposed this cross-section through the moraine, showing us that lovely distal slope till fabric with the long axes of the rocks in that moraine, the clasts in that moraine aligned down the distal slope of the moraine, having been kind of pushed over the top or bulldozed or dumped over the top of the moraine by the glacier, and then settling on that distal slope. And so that moraine has survived deglaciation very, very happily, thank you very much. But in other situations, the losing of the glacier can have a major impact on the moraines or on the landforms. For example, as illustrated in these pictures, by the loss of ice support. either lateral support with a glacier up against the edge of a moraine, or internal support where a moraine is cored by glacier ice, or by subjacent support where the glacier is underneath a supraglacial moraine. In all of those situations, as the ice disappears upon deglaciation, the moraine loses support and can then collapse or lose its morphology, lose its integrity. And in the big photo at the back of those three, you can just about make out me for scale in my red boots running down the front of that moraine. And behind me, in the background, you can see that, well, I'm not really running down the front of a moraine, I'm running down the front of a great big pile of ice that has a very thin coating of moraine till debris on top of it. And that's what a lot of ice marginal moraines, particularly in colder environments, are like, because the debris protects the ice underneath them from melting, and a large bulk of the moraine can actually be this ice core rather than being just made of till or debris. And so that loss of ice support is really important in determining the long-term future of glacial moraines, for example. Also important to consider the other processes that are going on at the ice margin, for example at the ice margin or subglacially or supraglacially during that deglaciation process. As the ice is disappearing, typically, for example, there'll be lots of water swilling around in lots of environments, and that water is likely to remobilise sediment that has previously been deposited by the glacier. So in these images that you can see on the slide here, we have a proglacial stream, obviously remobilising and carrying sediment, but also mass movement, mud flow down the side of a hill slope in front of a retreating glacier, and at the bottom right hand side there, water emerging from underneath the glacier. And during the deglaciation phase, that remobilisation of debris by water on top of, underneath or in front of the glacier is very important in changing the nature of the landforms that the glacier has already created, and in creating new landforms associated with this deglaciation phase. And some of these landforms, some landforms associated with glaciation, are really fragile compared with those Pyramid Peak Mountains I showed you a second ago at the Athabasca Glacier. This is a little lake basin on the edge of Solheimjökull, just a tiny little basin, maybe 40-50 metres in length at most. Where a little hollow in the hillside, up against the edge of the glacier, periodically collects water. Sometimes that water then escapes down a hole into the subglacial zone, and the lake drains. And you can see in both of these images shorelines cut into the hillside in the big image, and actually marked on the side of the glacier in the debris on the glacier surface in the lower image, indicating the levels to which that lake water can reach. And for several years we visited Solheimjökull and found this lake in various stages of filling or emptying. But then one year, moving on to the next slide, one year we went back and the entire lake basin had filled in with debris being carried into it by an ice marginal stream, a stream running along the edge of the glacier. The lake hadn't drained into the glacier this year, and so the whole lake had filled up with debris. In this image, I didn't have a person for scale in this image, so I've just put a little cartoon figure of a kamikaze skier on the glacier surface there to give you some idea of scale. But if you imagine now the glacier here, which is filling up the valley that we're standing on the edge of now, and just leaving these little gaps or dips or hollows at the glacier side against the hillside, what's going to happen to all that debris up against jammed in between the glacier and the hillside when the glacier disappears? Well, it's in a really unstable position and has very little chance of survival. You might perhaps get a came terrace. If you don't know what a came terrace is, now's a good time to go and look it up. But you might get a came terrace, for example, being left behind on the hillside if the glacier disappears. But more than likely, all trace of that sediment is likely to be lost, washed away down the hillside as the glacier disappears. So some landforms are simply not going to survive deglaciation. Now, we can talk about landforms and whether they will survive. Well, what about end glacial features? And in particular, we've been talking in this module a little bit about basal ice fabrics and structures, debris fabrics, debris structures within the basal ice. And we made the point that the structures, the fabrics in the basal ice debris can tell you something about the processes which have created the basal ice, so you can look at these structures and figure out something about subglacial conditions, glacier dynamics and so on. So it'd be a really interesting area of research if these sediment or debris fabrics and structures were preserved in post-glacial sediments, that'd be a fantastic opportunity to go and look at debris left behind by glaciers, and from that debris, from those sediments, reconstruct the basal ice layer. And understanding how the basal ice layer relates to the glacier characteristics, we could, from those sediments, work our way all the way back to figure out what the glacial environment was like. And that takes us back to one of the big topics that this module has focused on, this whole idea of reading sediments and landforms and landscapes to figure out what processes must have created them, and therefore to figure out what kind of glacial environment must have been in place for them to have been created. So what's the survival potential of the basal ice layer? In this picture there's me perched. This was in the days long before health and safety, so there was me without any ropes or without a hard hat on, perched on the steep sloping front of the glacier there, hacking out bits of debris with an ice axe. But that photo shows quite nicely the situation that debris emerging from the ice, in a position very much like I'm sat in there, it's in a very unstable position. So as that glacier advances, but it simultaneously is melting ice off the front of it, well, debris that's emerging is just going to be rolling down the front of that glacier with water swilling around as well, and it's going to be deposited without any record of its original end glacial debris structures being preserved in the moraine, or so you would imagine. Is that the way you imagine it would be? Well, imagine you're doing a test question then, or suppose you were doing an essay question on to what extent can structures from the basal ice layer be preserved in glacial sediments. And thinking about that previous slide, you'd think, well, not very much then, I assume. But here's some work that's been done at the Matanuska Glacier. You've heard of the Matanuska Glacier before, and you've heard of Dan Lawson's work. Well, this is some more of his research. One of the things that Dan Lawson was doing at the Matanuska Glacier was looking not only at the glacier and not only at the debris within the glacier, but also at the debris, the sediments that were being deposited by the glacier. And he was comparing, one aspect of his work was to compare the sediment structures within the basal ice to the sediment structures in the debris left behind after the glacier, that was left behind, that was deposited by the glacier. So in this image, looking particularly at the left-hand side, the top and bottom of that image, he's done fabric diagrams illustrating the orientation of clasts within the basal ice layer and, in this case, within a surface melt-out till. So the bottom fabric diagram there is telling you about the direction in which the clasts in the basal ice are pointing. The top fabric diagram is telling you about the orientation that the clasts in the melt-out till above this basal ice. So we're looking at a glacier surface with basal ice going all the way to the top of the glacier where the ice is thin and melting out onto the glacier surface. And what he says there is that the bulk texture and pebble orientations are preserved. So the broad scale structure of the basal ice is actually preserved in this situation because the ice is melting away, leaving behind the sediment more or less in situ as the ice leaves it, and it's preserving that kind of sediment. We're not having remobilization, we're not having any kind of resedimentation of this diamict. It isn't turning into a flow till, it is simply the release of basal ice sediment into a supraglacial deposit. And we retain some kind of record of the structure there. In the next slide, it's the same. He's doing the same thing here, but here he's looking at the bottom of the basal ice layer against the glacier bed. And in this situation he says bulk texture and pebble fabric of till are virtually identical in the subglacial sediment to what they are in the ice source. So in other words, subglacially, in this situation he's finding that the fabric of the basal ice layer is actually being preserved. So what we have there is, what I've shown you in the last 5 minutes, is lots of examples where you wouldn't expect sediment fabrics from inside a glacier to be preserved very well, but also some situations where you might expect preservation to occur. And I guess that's my closing point for the module, is all the way through we've seen lots of different situations in glaciers, and I've often said, well, if you can imagine it happening in a glacier, it probably can. Before I ever visited a glacier, I thought there would be strict rules that this can happen and that can happen, but oh, this won't happen and oh, that won't happen. But in fact, I've seen so many weird and wonderful things going on at glacier margins and in subglacial environments when you mix together all the different controlling forces, all sorts of different things can happen. If the conditions are right, if the materials are right, and if the available energy to drive processes is operating in the appropriate way. So all sorts of different things can happen. The fun, the trick, is trying to figure out what are those situations. Then when you find the long-term surviving record of those events, trying to work out, well, what were the conditions under which these landforms were created. And that's the kind of interesting analysis that doing this module has, I hope, brought you to. We've done the glaciology, we've done the glacier dynamics, we've done the hydrology, we've done the isotopes, we've started looking at geomorphology, we've looked at landforms and landscapes. Well, now hopefully you can tie all that together and see some component of a landform or a landscape or a geomorphic process in a particular glacial setting, and from that work back to figure out how the glacier is working by looking at the landforms, or predicting what the landforms are going to be like by knowing what the glacier is like and predicting what it's going to do in the future. So, by way of conclusion to that last question, to what extent can structures from the basal ice layer be preserved in glacial sediments? Well, broad stratigraphic distinctions are often preserved. Detailed englacial structures, rarely. But till structures, and this is an important point, not just for till, but for all the geomorphology we've been looking at, the features that you're seeing reflect a number of different things. So, till structures, they don't just reflect the process of deposition. With glacial till, it's a deposit. Yeah, but there's more to it than that. Yes, till structures do reflect processes of deposition, but till structures also commonly reflect processes of re-sedimentation. Till debris can be remobilized, transported and redeposited, retaining some of its original signature, but not all of it. So there's a deposition, there's revigoration and resedimentation of that material, as well as sometimes, as in that example from Lawson there, sometimes also some original entrainment fabric or englacial fabric that can tell us, even in the long surviving sediments, can still tell us something about the fabrics that existed in the glacier itself. So that was just a few words. It's a big topic. You can go and explore more of that in the literature and look at the idea of paraglacial landscapes, where after the glaciers have gone, a landscape or a land system has to readjust to its new environment, and there's this kind of transition period when it's no longer glacial, but it hasn't yet become fully post-glacial, and that paraglacial transition is a really important aspect, again, of understanding post-glacial landforms and landscapes. But I just wanted to say a few words as part of this final session about deglaciation, because it would have just seemed wrong not to finish our story of glaciers and glacial geomorphology by looking at the part of the story where the glaciers, much like this module, are finally disappearing.